1967 and 1968 were big years for the New York City rapid transit system. The Chrystie Street connection opened, finally merging the IND and BMT divisions into one B division. This meant that the BMT routes had to be given lettered names to replace their numbers. Some BMT lettered names had existed before, but we will be discussing the ones included on maps and used by communications, assigned in 1967 and 1968 after the opening of the Chrystie Street connection. We will also not be discussing the temporary routes that were in place after the first connection opened but before the second. Most of the new route names were made in accordance to the IND's naming system, with express routes using single letters and local routes using double letters. Let's take a look at the changes in BMT routes before and after the Chrystie Street connection. For this video, we will focus on weekday and rush hour service. We'll begin with the routes in 1966 before the connection opened. They were numbered from 1 to 16. Routes 1 to 7 used the Southern Division, routes 8 and 9 used the defunct Queens Division, and routes 10 to 16 used the Eastern Division. Before 1967, the Southern and Eastern Divisions were mostly kept separate. By 1966, the 8 and 9 Queens Division routes no longer ran since the Flushing line had been IRT only for years and the Astoria line had become part of other routes. The BMT-1 was the Brighton Beach line, which usually ran from Astoria or Midtown via local or express in Manhattan, using the bridge or tunnel and running along the Brighton line to Brighton Beach or Coney Island. Pretty much any train using the Brighton line was a 1. The 2 was the 4th Avenue line. It was always local throughout its route and ran from 71st Ave on the IND in Queens, through Manhattan on the BMT, through the tunnel and down 4th Ave to 95th Street. It was basically the same as today's R service. The 3 was the West End line, which either ran from Astoria and express via the bridge, or used the Nassau Loop, then went express down 4th Ave and along the West End line to Coney Island. The 4 was the Sea Beach line, which ran from Midtown via express and the bridge, down 4th Ave Express, and along the Sea Beach line to Coney Island. The 5 was the Culver line, which at that point would only run as a shuttle between 9th Ave and Ditmas Ave. The 6 was a defunct service which used the 5th Avenue elevated that had already been entirely demolished, so the 6 designator was no longer used. The 7 was the Franklin Avenue line, which also only ran as a shuttle, this one between Fulton Street and Prospect Park. The Eastern Division had a lot of interesting routes and several whose lines were completely gone. The BMT-10 was the Myrtle Avenue Chambers Street line, which ran local from Chambers Street along Broadway, Brooklyn to Myrtle Ave before turning onto Myrtle Ave and continuing to Metropolitan Ave in Queens. It only ran during rush hours. The 11 was the Myrtle Avenue J Street line, which was the last elevated route in the city, running from J Street in Brooklyn along Myrtle Ave to Metropolitan Ave in Queens. The 12 had used the Lexington Ave elevated, which almost none of still existed. The 13 had used the Fulton Street elevated, which was also mostly gone, with the remaining portion taken over by the IND. Both the 12 and 13 designators were not used in 1966. The 14 was the Broadway-Brooklyn line, which, like the 10, only ran during rush hours. When it was running, it ran local from Canal Street on the Nassau Street line, along Broadway-Brooklyn, and to 168th Street in Jamaica, running skip-stop on the Jamaica line with the 15 in the peak direction. Some trains would turn after Eastern Parkway onto the Canarsie line down to Rockaway Parkway. The 15 was the Jamaica line, which ran local on the whole length of the Nassau Street, Broadway-Brooklyn, and Jamaica lines, from Broad Street in Manhattan to 168th Street in Jamaica. During rush hours, it would run express on the Broadway-Brooklyn line in the peak direction, running skip-stop with the 14 on the Jamaica line during rush hours, also only in the peak direction. Finally, the 16 was the 14th Street Canarsie line, which ran from 8th Ave in Manhattan, to Rockaway Parkway in Canarsie and was identical to today's L service. In 1967 and 1968, the Chrystie Street connection opened, meaning that trains from the IND on 6th Avenue could switch to the Nassau Street tracks and arrive at Essex Street, or they could switch onto the Manhattan Bridge North tracks and, eventually, arrive at DeKalb Ave. The Broadway tracks had been rerouted onto the South tracks, so any Nassau Loop service was no longer possible. On the Southern Division, the BMT-1 was partially replaced by the D, which used Brighton Local from Coney Island and then the IND in Manhattan. It was also partially replaced by the QJ, which used Brighton Local from Coney Island and then went through the tunnel and onto the Jamaica line, continuing to 168th Street. During rush hour in the peak direction, QB trains also ran, using Brighton Local from Brighton Beach, then running over the bridge and up to 57th Street Express on Broadway. Interestingly, at this time no trains used Brighton Express, not due to a track problem, but because it was thought to be unnecessary. The 2 became the Double R, except for the fact that it now used Astoria in Queens rather than Queens Boulevard. For a service via Broadway Local and Queens Boulevard Local, the Double E ran from Whitehall Street to 71st Ave. During rush hours, some Double R trains would turn onto Nassau Street and end at Chambers Street. The 3 could no longer use the Nassau Loop, but the B served West End Local before continuing express up 4th Ave, across the bridge and onto the IND. The 4 became the N, which ran via Sea Beach, 4th Ave Express, over the bridge and up Broadway Express, ending at 57th Street. The 5 became the Double S, using the same shuttle route, and the 7 became another Double S, also using the same short route as before. On the Eastern Division, the BMT-10 became the M, now running between Broad Street and Metropolitan Ave during rush hour in the peak direction and using Broadway Brooklyn Express. The 11 became the MJ. The 14's Canarsie branch was not replaced as trains stopped using the connection between the Broadway Brooklyn and Canarsie lines and a transfer was required. The 15 was replaced by the aforementioned QJ, which used Jamaica, Broadway Brooklyn, and Nassau Street Local, before continuing to Brooklyn via the tunnel. During rush hours, QJ trains ran express in the peak direction on the Broadway Brooklyn line, and Double K trains ran coming from the IND, then running local using the Broadway Brooklyn line, ending at Eastern Parkway, unless they were traveling in the peak direction, when they would continue to 168th Street, running skip stop on the Jamaica line in the peak direction with the QJ. The 16 became the Double L using the exact same route. It's interesting how some routes didn't change at all, while others were merged, split, or had their rush hour patterns altered. Some routes were changed again after only a few years, while some stayed almost the same to this day. Numbered designations could still be seen on some equipment until 1982. In 1979, route colors began being assigned based on trunk line, and in 1985, double-letter designations were abolished, and all B division routes were given single-letter designations, most of which exist to this day. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!